July 1944. As German forces retreat through Normandy, their pioneer battalions leave behind a weapon more feared than their artillery. The S-mine 35, Bouncing Betty, now upgraded with hair-thin pull wires so well concealed that Allied intelligence labels them undetectable by visual means. In the 3 weeks after Operation Cobra, US engineer battalions record the highest booby trap casualty rate of the entire European campaign, most occurring inside darkened doorways where men never even saw the wire that killed them. Historians call this period the pull wire crisis. Within field headquarters, officers debate a bleak question. If the enemy's wire cannot be seen, is there any way left to survive it? Someone on the ground, someone with no scientific training, will soon answer that question in a way no one expects. Behind him, a staff sergeant from the 121st Engineer Combat Battalion is not watching the doorway at all. His attention is on the pale string he's been dragging ahead of the patrol, tied to the muzzle band of his M1 carbine and trailing about a metre in front. He has led with it along several streets already. Now he feels it tighten against his weapon and sees the faint V-shape where it has been pulled sideways toward the open frame. Field manuals back at company headquarters describe how a man in his position is supposed to work. Proceed slowly, probe the ground ahead with a bayonet, check stairwells and doorways with mirrors and careful fingers. They do not mention string. Yet here, on this anonymous street, his improvised feeler has already done something the book techniques could not. It has located an invisible line of death without a boot heel or fingertip touching it. Somewhere up in the dark interior, a German S-mine or rigged stick grenade is waiting for pressure on that pull wire. The patrol backs away and marks the spot. No mine explodes, no one is hit. For once, the lesson is delivered without blood. What lingers afterward is a realization that does not yet have a name. If a scrap of string can quietly defeat a device meant to maim a squad, what else about their duel with German mines has been accepted too easily as unchangeable? In a war dominated by steel, blast and weight, survival here has just been bought by the lightest possible touch, and almost no one beyond this street yet understands what that implies. By 1943, Germany's retreating armies have learned a hard lesson of modern war. Concrete bunkers and fixed defensive lines can be mapped, shelled, and bypassed. Mines and booby traps, by contrast, require almost no manpower once emplaced, and can continue killing long after the last uniform is withdrawn. In Italy, and then across France, Wehrmacht pioneer units begin to treat wire, fuse and explosive as a kind of invisible rearguard. Roads, stairwells, hedgerows, cellar doors, and barn paths are laced with pull wires linked to S-mine 35s, shoe mines, and stick grenades. Some wires are strung at chest height, some just above boot level, some buried in curtains or banister rails. Few are meant to stop tanks. Most are designed to punish curiosity and momentum, to catch the man who pushes a door, takes a shortcut, or is simply in a hurry. Allied engineers respond not with improvisation but with doctrine. In training areas in Britain and North Africa, instructors set up model minefields and house fronts, then walk classes through approved procedures. Manuals describe careful probing with bayonets, inspection with mirrors, and standard search patterns for mined rooms, check thresholds, stair risers, window frames, likely hiding spots. The instructions are thorough and cautious, the product of experience in North Africa and the early Italian campaign. They are also agonizingly slow. In Italian hill towns like San Pietro and French towns like Saint-Lô, units trying to keep up with advancing infantry often face a brutal arithmetic, either spend hours inching forward or accept that some men will walk into unseen wires. After-action reports from 1943 and early 1944 reflect this tension in careful language. Officers write of unavoidable losses and necessary risks in urban clearance, phrases that will become grimly familiar. They note that pull wires are inherently hard to see. Camouflage, dust, smoke, fading light, and sheer fatigue all conspire against the human eye. A wire drawn taut at knee height across a dim corridor can be effectively invisible until the moment it is touched, and in that moment there is no second chance. Within this mindset, the pull wire problem is classified as dirty work rather than a solvable technical challenge. Training emphasizes discipline and procedure, not invention. A good engineer is expected to follow the book, move slowly, and accept that the work carries a high personal cost. No one in the chain of command is waiting for a radical new method. the assumption is that the limits have been reached. It will take someone willing to question that assumption, on a street that looks no different from dozens of others, to suggest that the real problem may not be the mines themselves, but the narrow way in which everyone has been taught to sense them. He does not look like an innovator, and nothing in his file suggests he will ever change the way an army fights. He's a 24-year-old staff sergeant from Ohio, a man more familiar with axle grease and broken fan belts than engineering equations. Before the war, he spent his days under the hood of cars in his uncle's garage, where customers judged a mechanic not by credentials, but by whether their engine ran afterward. His hands learned things faster than his eyes did. At Fort Leonard Wood, where the 121st Engineer Combat Battalion trained, he was not listed among the elite. Instructors noted that he absorbed procedures slowly, but had an uncanny ability to notice loose fittings, weak joints, and frayed cables before anyone else. He couldn't always articulate why something looked wrong, but he sensed it. That sense, unremarkable in peacetime, would prove essential in France. By June 1944, after landing behind the initial assault waves, he had already cleared roadblocks, lifted teller mines from shallow pits, and marked safe lanes through hedgerows. He had also watched men die to traps that manuals described clinically as booby devices. He remembered each incident in detail: a cellar door pushed open without hesitation, a stair rail brushed while taking cover, a wire strung low through tall grass that caught a man at precisely the wrong moment. Official reports categorized these events as unavoidable losses. That phrasing disturbed him more each time he saw it. He could not accept the implication that death by a hidden wire was a law of nature rather than a failure of method. What he observed over and over was that the weakest link was human sight. Soldiers were being asked to spot nearly invisible threads under the worst possible conditions: dust blowing in the wind, sweat stinging the eyes, adrenaline narrowing the field of view, enemy fire pressuring every movement. Vision alone was expected to defeat devices specifically designed to evade it. In quieter moments between assignments, he experimented with scraps of string or cord, stretching them between fence posts or door frames, running his fingers lightly along them with his eyes closed. He discovered that tension, resistance, and vibration communicated information that sight missed. The idea was still vague, more instinct than theory, but it stayed with him. Through the summer, he carried this private frustration like a tool waiting for the right job. In his mind, he replayed incidents that ended badly, trying to imagine at what point another sense, touch instead of sight, movement instead of inspection, might have intervened. He knew better than to bring the idea to officers who lived by procedure. Doctrine left little room for improvisation, and junior engineers were expected to follow, not question. Still, he waited. He watched. And on a street in Normandy, weeks after the breakout from St. Lo, that moment finally arrived. A place where his quiet skepticism about unavoidable losses intersected with the reality of a lethal wire stretched taut across a doorway. The thought that had been forming for months found its purpose in an instant. The string he carried for convenience suddenly felt like something else entirely, an answer waiting to be demonstrated. If you're enjoying this story, hit like, share it with someone who also loves hidden chapters of history, and subscribe for more hidden stories of World War II. And after you finish the documentary, share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your take. It begins without ceremony, with the sort of debris soldiers normally step over without thinking. In August 1944, as the 4th Infantry Division pushes deeper through the Norman countryside, another town, half demolished by artillery, stripped of glass and civilians, lies in their path. During a pause in movement, a gust of wind lifts a strand of packaging twine from a broken window frame. It hangs there for a moment, suspended over rubble before dropping at the staff sergeant's feet. He bends down to pick it up, intending only to pocket it for later use. But when he pulls it through his fingers, he notices the way it snags on rough surfaces, catching on fragments of brick and splintered wood with a distinct, unmistakable drag. The idea crystallizes, built from a dozen half-formed observations. If a line of string trails ahead of a man, low, loose, angled slightly forward, then any hidden pull wire at that height should strike the string before striking flesh. No advanced theory is needed. The logic is simple geometry. A taut wire will intercept the line first, producing a small detectable resistance. The string becomes a surrogate sense, a sacrificial contact point. Farmers use chains to locate buried stumps. Mechanics drag loose wires to find hidden catches in tight engine bays. Now, the same principle, carried across continents, settles onto this ruined French street. At the edge of town, he knots the twine to the barrel band of his M1 carbine, letting it trail roughly a metre ahead. The men behind him glance at it and dismiss it as an odd habit. They joke that he's fishing for Germans. He ignores them and experiments with the length, adjusting it until it moves freely without tangling. As he walks, the string brushes debris. Each tug transmits up the weapon in subtle ways, a harsh snag for jagged metal, a soft drag for loose dust, a clean sideways draw when something rigid and anchored intercepts it. Most of the time, the string finds nothing of consequence. But while passing a doorway, its interior unnaturally dark compared to the sunlit street, the line jerks sideways with a tension that feels different. Not rough, not heavy, clean, taut, unmistakably deliberate. He stops immediately, studying the angle of pull. Then he motions for the others to hold position. Instead of stepping forward, he angles himself to the side of the doorway and peers in. Across the threshold, nearly invisible from even a short distance, runs a German pull wire exactly at ankle height, tied to a small concealed mechanism deeper inside. The wire is positioned so precisely that a normal sweep of the eyes would never find it until too late. The jokes end instantly. Word travels through the patrol with the speed of adrenaline. A simple piece of twine, dismissed seconds earlier, has detected a trap that official methods likely would have missed. The discovery forces a reconsideration none of them were prepared for. If something so humble can find what trained vision cannot, then perhaps the battlefield still contains untested solutions lying in plain sight. On this street, at least, the line between improvisation and survival has just shifted, and the string trailing from a rifle no longer looks foolish at all. The first true test does not arrive in a quiet street or empty building, but on a stretch of road where timing and pressure collide. Days after the doorway discovery, the 4th Infantry Division receives orders to push west toward a critical junction used by armoured units. Intelligence labels the route lightly mined, a phrase infantry platoon leaders privately distrust. Lightly mined can mean anything from a handful of devices to an unpleasant surprise, arranged by retreating German pioneer detachments. What is known is that speed matters. The battalion must clear and secure the road before nightfall, or risk losing contact with forward elements already pressing ahead. The staff sergeant understands the dilemma. Traditional probing will be slow, painfully so, and the higher command has little tolerance for delays. Yet rushing blindly risks the sort of losses he refuses to accept as inevitable. So without issuing a speech or asking permission, he improvises again. This time he knots a longer cord, thicker, more durable, and ties small scraps of cloth along its length. The cloth markers flutter faintly as the line moves, making its motion easier to observe. One end is fixed to his carbine as before, the other is handed to a second engineer several metres behind, forming a loose sweep that glides across the road at mid-shin height. Officers watching from the side expect confusion. They foresee the line snagging constantly, halting progress to a crawl, but as the team advances, a rhythm forms. The string tightens. Halt. A man kneels to inspect the snag. If harmless, they proceed. If not, they probe and mark, move again, tighten, halt, inspect, confirm. The system is simple, almost primitive, yet it converts every uncertain step into a controlled process. Midway down the road, the string jerks sideways with a sudden precision that differs from all previous snags. The second man feels it at the same moment, the subtle shift transmitted along the line. The sergeant lowers himself to examine the direction of pull. The tension leads not to rubble or metal fragments, but to a narrow ditch beside the road. A cautious probe reveals a taut German pull wire anchored beneath a clump of grass, linked to a buried S-mine placed exactly at the height that would catch the legs of a moving column. It is the kind of trap that kills in the open, where no cover exists, where medics cannot reach quickly. The discovery ripples through the detachment. It is one thing for the string to detect a doorway trap. It is another to uncover a field device positioned perfectly for maximum casualties. By the time the engineers reach the far end of the road, the pattern is undeniable. The line has helped identify more wires than previous sweeps on similar terrain, without costing a single limb or life. The after-action notes are understated, as they often are. Improvised method effective, time to clear not significantly increased. But among the soldiers who walked behind that line, the shift is profound. A sense of possibility replaces resignation. Word spreads along mess lines and bivouacs. If you can find a piece of cord, tie it low, and let it go ahead of you, you might just live longer than the manual predicts. Innovation in war rarely travels through official channels first. It moves through observation, rumour, and the quiet imitation of men who see something work. By early autumn 1944, the stupid string trick, still called that by some out of habit, begins appearing in places the sergeant never sets foot. A British Royal Engineers section in the Low Countries reads a brief note in a divisional newsletter describing the use of improvised drag lines for detecting tripwires. Canadian sappers near Caen notice American engineers sweeping doorways with cords and adopt the practice without comment. None of this is sanctioned, none is forbidden. It spreads because it makes sense. Sketches begin appearing on briefing boards, crude drawings of doorways with lines pulled across them, accompanied by quick captions like "test before entry" or "check at varied heights." Instructors who once discouraged improvisation now mention the method as an example of practical adaptation. The technique quietly earns a semi-official label, dragline feeler, in a field circular distributed to several engineer battalions. Still, most soldiers simply call it the string. As the method travels, it evolves. Engineers in one regiment tie short lengths of cord to bayonets and sweep them in arcs as they ascend stairwells. In another, jeep drivers fix multiple strings at different heights to the grille when moving slowly through suspicious alleys, watching for any unnatural twitch. In forested regions, patrols suspend the line slightly higher to detect wires strung between trees. Each adaptation arises from necessity, shaped by terrain and threat. What stays constant is the purpose, extending human senses into spaces where sight alone is inadequate. And slowly, patterns begin appearing in operational records. Casualty figures from booby traps in certain sectors start to dip. Not dramatically, but consistently. Analysts at Corps headquarters, reviewing compiled reports, notice clusters of lowered losses in units that mention improvised feelers in their notes. There is no citation, no award, no official recognition that a small idea is producing real consequences, but commanders who once dismissed the string now instruct platoon leaders to consider appropriate sweep methods, a phrase that quietly authorizes what soldiers were already doing. In the barracks, attitudes shift. What started as a joke becomes a routine precaution. Men tape cords to their rifles without prompting. They cut lengths from supply sacks before night patrols. They trust the method because it requires no belief, only results. Meanwhile, the engineer who conceived it sees the change with a mix of relief and unease. He knows the line is not perfect. In rain, it drags heavily. At night, it is harder to interpret. But each time he watches a new arrival use it, correctly he feels the gap widen between the old assumption of unavoidable losses and the evolving reality on the ground. Something once deemed inevitable is becoming, if not preventable, at least negotiable. That shift, quiet but unmistakable, signals that the battlefield's rules are not fixed after all, and that an idea born from frustration can travel farther than anyone ever expects. By late 1944, the Germans begin noticing something they cannot explain. In villages and forests where their pioneer units have spent long, methodical hours installing pull wires, the expected pattern of casualties no longer appears. Patrols still advance, doors still open, stairwells are still climbed, but in certain sectors traps are discovered intact rather than detonated. Wires meant to catch a man mid-step lie harmlessly cut, their anchoring nails pried loose with care. Chalk marks left by Allied engineers appear in places where, under normal circumstances, someone should already have been killed or maimed. Interrogations of captured engineers later record a repeated observation. They found devices without triggering them, as though they had new detectors. The Germans prepare for the possibility of a technological breakthrough. They do not imagine that the threat is a thin piece of string trailing from a rifle. Across the front, the duel becomes increasingly adaptive. German engineers respond first by varying their wire placements. Instead of keeping them low at ankle or shin height, positions optimized for men entering rooms under pressure, they begin stringing them chest-high in stairwells, mid-torso in narrow corridors, or even above head height where rafters still stand. They experiment with slack wires instead of taut ones, hoping the lack of initial tension will make them harder to detect. Meanwhile, Allied engineers evolve in parallel. In bombed-out factories and wrecked farmhouses, they begin sweeping multiple heights at once, using two cords tied to the same weapon, or employing a second man to cover higher lines. Some units create rudimentary T-shaped feelers from scrap wood to widen their sweep radius in wide halls. Reports filter upward along multiple chains of command. Intelligence summaries, usually dominated by discussions of tank battalions, artillery shortages, or road conditions, begin including small but telling notes. Increased sophistication in enemy booby trap placement observed, and engineer countermeasures appear effective in reducing activation. These comments are buried deep in appendices, far from the attention of theatre planners, but they reveal something striking. A mind-to-mind duel taking place beneath the larger movements of the war. For the staff sergeant from Ohio, now promoted and responsible for training newly arrived engineers, the duel feels both urgent and personal. He knows the method is crude, vulnerable to weather and conditions. Rain dampens the string, causing false snags. Night patrols require heightened coordination, as the line becomes harder to interpret. He spends evenings in requisitioned barns or half-collapsed barns, demonstrating the physics behind the feeler, how tension should feel through a weapon stock, how to distinguish accidental resistance from a true pull, how to adjust cord height depending on environment. He warns about complacency, reminding trainees that the string is not a shield but a warning system, one that fails if over-trusted. Still, he sees the difference in faces, not just among engineers but among infantrymen who no longer approach every doorway with fatalistic dread. The line offers something intangible, a sense that danger is negotiable, not absolute. Each saved step reinforces that idea. The duel continues through hedgerows, forests, factory ruins, and winter-frozen villages, and although no clear victor emerges, one truth becomes evident. The Germans can refine their traps indefinitely, but the Allies now possess something harder to counter, a method born not from policy or equipment, but from adaptation. And as long as soldiers keep dragging that line ahead of them, the battlefield's deadliest invisible weapon has lost part of its advantage. When the war in Europe finally ends in May 1945, much of the ad hoc ingenuity of frontline life dissolves almost instantly. Soldiers pack up, units disband, and the temporary gear of a mobile army is discarded on roadsides and in depots. Yet not everything disappears. Some ideas, especially the ones born from necessity rather than doctrine, linger in subtle, persistent ways. The concept of extending human senses with the simplest possible tool is one of them. In the months after Germany's surrender, Allied mine clearance teams spread across liberated territories to render towns safe for returning civilians. Many of these teams lack specialized detection equipment. In ruined buildings where roofs sag and floors are unstable, dragging a light cord ahead becomes a common precaution. These post-war crews, often working in silence amid shattered beams and collapsed walls, rediscover the same logic the staff sergeant learned the hard way. Vision alone is unreliable, especially in confined, cluttered environments. Field notes in ordnance reports occasionally mention physical feelers or manual tripline sweeps, understated references to a practice that has already migrated beyond its improvised origins. Meanwhile, the sergeant returns to Ohio and steps back into a life that looks much like the one he left behind. His days revolve around engines again, not explosives. To neighbours, he's simply another veteran who works hard and speaks little about his time overseas. His uniform stays folded in a trunk, his medals tucked away. If official histories mention him at all, it is in obscure appendices summarising field innovations. Noted utility of improvised drag lines for tripwire detection. The phrasing is clinical, detached, unconnected to the close calls and quiet victories that defined the method's evolution, and yet the idea does not disappear. As new conflicts arise, Korea, Vietnam, and later insurgencies in the Middle East, the principle resurfaces. In training courses for explosive ordnance disposal specialists, instructors reference low-tech fallback options when electronic detectors fail. Sometimes they demonstrate it with a piece of cord tied across a doorway, showing how it moves when disturbed. Soldiers who deploy to remote outposts or unstable buildings often carry lengths of paracord for reasons they cannot fully articulate. It is simply what those before them did. By the early 2000s, when counter-IED teams in Iraq confront environments filled with improvised traps, the same logic governs certain search techniques. Before stepping through a breached wall or doorway, sweep a line, check for resistance, look for unnatural movement. Reports from one army unit describe how, after an IED blast disabled their metal detectors, they improvised using water bottles and string, echoes of long-forgotten field notes from 1944. The link is rarely acknowledged, but it exists passed down through practice rather than attribution. In museums dedicated to military engineering, a few quiet displays show artifacts that represent this lineage. A length of cord tied to a rusted rifle barrel, a diagram illustrating early booby trap countermeasures. None of these items draw crowds, but in their simplicity is a reminder of a lesson that transcends wars and decades, that sometimes the most effective answers come not from advanced machinery or elaborate planning, but from a willingness to question assumptions at the moment they become deadly. And so, the idea remains, modest, thin, almost invisible, like the slack line of string once trailing across a Norman street. It moves slightly in the air of memory, subtle but persistent, marking the boundary between what soldiers expect and what they can prevent. It carries forward not as a celebrated invention, but as a quiet refusal to let hidden dangers dictate the terms of survival.